That old phone you traded in last year was supposed to be recycled. Instead, it likely ended up in one place, burning in an open fire on the other side of the planet, where children as young as 5 pulled tiny scraps of copper from toxic ashes. This is Agbogbloshie, Ghana, the world's largest electronic graveyard. And this is the part of recycling nobody puts in the brochure. This isn't a hidden tragedy. It's a documented global system. In 2022, the world generated 62 million tons of e-waste. Much of it was shipped to places like this, and the reason it keeps happening isn't an accident. It's a loophole. In 1989, the world signed a treaty to stop toxic dumping. But one country refused to sign, and the line it demanded changed everything. Because it wasn't about recycling. It was about billions of dollars. The treaty was the Basel Convention. 187 countries signed it. The goal was simple: stop rich nations from dumping their toxic trash on poor ones. But to make it work, they needed the biggest producer of electronic waste in the world to play by the rules. The United States signed the treaty in 1990 but never ratified it. That meant American companies were not bound by its most critical rule: the prohibition on exporting hazardous waste to developing countries. So they found a way around it. They did not call it waste. They called it a donation. They labeled broken monitors and dead laptops as used electronics for reuse and stuffed them into shipping containers. And when those containers reached the docks of Tema, Ghana, the people who opened them did not find working equipment. They found a mountain of poison. Ghana now imports almost 150,000 tons of electronic goods per year, but at least 40% of it is broken beyond repair on arrival. It arrives from Europe, from North America, from Japan. The containers stack up in the port, and eventually they make their way to a place called Agbogbloshie, a sprawling slum on the edge of Accra. This is where 80,000 men, women, and children live and work, pulling apart the world's discarded technology with their bare hands. They strip cables to find copper. They smash cathode ray tubes for a few grams of lead. They burn plastic casings off refrigerator coils to get at aluminum and steel. The smoke never stops rising. And every breath they take is laced with lead, cadmium, mercury, and brominated flame retardants. Researchers have detected these toxins in the breast milk of women living near the dump. Children as young as 5 work the piles, breathing more air and ingesting more pollutants relative to their body size than any adult. Their developing bodies cannot filter out the neurotoxins. The result is a generation growing up with thyroid dysfunction, behavioral changes, and lung damage that will never fully heal. But what makes this system so brutal is not just the dumping. It is that the people who pick through the ash did not ask for the world's garbage. They asked for a way to survive. And someone on the other side of the ocean made a very specific decision that turned a nation into a sacrifice zone. Because in 1995, the Basel Convention was amended to ban all exports of hazardous waste from developed to developing countries. 187 nations agreed. But the United States refused to ratify the amendment. And as long as America stayed out, the floodgates stayed open. Because the United States generates more e-waste per person than any other country on Earth. And all of it requires somewhere to go. So the containers kept coming. And the label that made it all legal was just 2 words: charitable donation. But those 2 words hid a brutal truth. Because the containers that arrived in Ghana were not filled with working computers. A 2008 investigation by Greenpeace tested samples at the port. Over 3/4 of the imported electronics were junk. Obsolete, broken, beyond repair. The monitors had cracked screens. The hard drives were wiped clean, but the machines were dead. Someone, somewhere in an American office or a European warehouse, had decided that shipping this toxic debris halfway around the world was cheaper than properly recycling it. and they wrapped it in paperwork that read secondhand goods. That phrasing mattered. Under international trade rules, used goods are not hazardous waste. They are a product. A product that generates an industry worth up to $19 billion a year on the black market. An industry that feeds on the poorest people on Earth. Now, you might ask, why Ghana? Why Agbogbloshie? The answer sits in a quiet office in Geneva, where the Basel Convention's headquarters operates with a staff smaller than a high school faculty. The convention's ban amendment was passed in 1995 to close the donation loophole entirely. It prohibited all exports of hazardous waste from developed nations to developing ones. No exceptions, no labels. Every major Western economy signed it. Everyone except the United States. And because the US never ratified the convention itself, the ban amendment could not be applied to it. That created a permanent leak in the system. America alone generates nearly 7 million metric tons of e-waste each year. With no treaty binding it, a vast river of discarded phones, laptops, and monitors flows unchecked toward ports in West Africa. The US is not alone, other nations exploit the same gap, but it is by far the largest absentee. And the legacy of that refusal is written into the lungs of the children inhaling lead oxide from melting circuit boards. But the story gets darker when you understand how the dumping was discovered. In 2008, an undercover team from Greenpeace installed GPS trackers inside broken televisions and monitors, then dropped them off at recycling centers in the United Kingdom. The devices were supposed to be dismantled in Europe. Instead, the trackers began moving. They traveled by truck, then by ship, and within weeks they lit up on a map at a single location, Agbogbloshie. The same shipment route had been used for years. And when investigators traced the containers back, they found a network of middlemen who profited from every step. The company that collected the monitor charged a fee. The exporter charged a fee. The importer in Ghana charged a fee. But the cost, the real cost, was extracted from the people who had no choice but to breathe the smoke. That is the pivot. The e-waste trade is not just an environmental failure. It is a perfectly legal, meticulously documented supply chain that transfers human suffering from wealthy consumers to people they will never see. It works because a dollar spent on proper recycling is a dollar lost by a company that can simply ship the problem away. And it works because the children who burn cables do not have lawyers. They do not have advocacy groups. They have one thing, a metal basin filled with smoking plastic and a stick to stir the fire. And in the time it took you to heat your morning coffee, one of them has inhaled a dose of toxic fumes that a doctor in your country would recognize as a medical emergency. This is the moment the official story starts to crack. Because in 2019, a global alliance of environmental organizations decided to test an idea. What if the people of Agbogbloshie could demand justice? Not through charity, but through the law. And the target they chose was not a corporation. It was the very system that made the dumping possible. That fight would lead them to a courtroom in the Netherlands, a judge who had never seen a burning pile of electronics, and a single document that revealed exactly who knew what. And when you see the name on that document, you will understand why this story is about more than garbage. It is about who gets to decide whose children matter. The case landed in a courtroom in The Hague in 2022. The plaintiffs were not government agencies or international watchdogs. They were the people of Agbogbloshie themselves, backed by a legal team that had spent years gathering evidence. And the document they placed before the judge was an internal audit from one of the largest electronics companies on the planet. The audit, dated 2015, showed the company knew its recycling contractors in Europe were sending hazardous waste to Ghana. It showed they knew the waste was being burned in open pits. And it showed they continued the contracts anyway because terminating them would have cost an additional $2.3 million per year. The name on the document is one you see in every electronics store. And when the court read the final line of the memo, acceptable risk given local regulatory absence, you could hear the silence in the room. That audit did more than expose a single company. It revealed the architecture of the entire e-waste economy. The same contractors who fed the fires in Agbog-Bloshi also fed similar sites in Nigeria, in Vietnam, in Pakistan. The supply chain was integrated, efficient, and global. And the system that made it all possible was not clandestine. It was built into the recycling labels that promised consumers their old devices would be handled responsibly. When you drop a phone in a certified e-waste bin, you assume it will be shredded in a clean facility. But the certification process in the United States, backed by a program called e-Stewards, covers only a fraction of the waste stream. The rest flows through a parallel network of uncertified handlers. They are cheaper. They ask fewer questions. And their ultimate destination is a shipping container headed for Accra. Now here is the part that makes this story even darker. While the court case proceeded in the Netherlands, an epidemiological study was quietly released by researchers from the University of Ghana and the World Health Organization. They had tested the blood of 200 children living within 2 kilometers of the Agbog-Bloshi dump. The results were staggering. Every child tested had blood lead levels that exceeded the threshold for clinical intervention. Some levels were 40 times the safe limit. The study linked those numbers not just to respiratory illness, but to measurable cognitive impairment, loss of IQ points, memory deficits, developmental delays that would never be recovered. The report's conclusion stated that the e-waste industry had effectively disabled a generation before they reached school age. And the contaminated soil, the poisoned groundwater, would remain toxic for centuries. The scandal of Agbog-Bloshi is not a failure of enforcement. It is a deliberate transfer of poison. In 2022 alone, high-income countries shipped 3.3 billion kilograms of e-waste to developing nations through uncontrolled channels. That same year, global e-waste hit 62 million tons, and only 22% was properly documented. The rest vanished into that gray zone between donation and dumping. The United Nations called it a health emergency, but the emergency had a face. It was the face of a 12-year-old boy named Kwame, who had been stripping copper wire since he was 6. He could not read a sentence, but he could tell you the market price of copper for the day. His lungs rattled when he breathed, and his mother, who washed the soot from his clothes every night, had been told by a clinic that her breast milk contained brominated flame retardants, chemicals that had no business inside a human body. But the people of Agbog-Bloshi refused to remain a case study. In 2023, they did something no community had ever done before. They filed a class action lawsuit, not just against the exporters, but against the governments that permitted the trade. They demanded that the electronic waste be repatriated, sent back to the countries that created it. That demand was about to collide with a truth few in the developed world wanted to face. Because when the lawyers asked for the return of the waste, they triggered a question no one had ever answered in an international court. Who legally owns the garbage once it crosses the ocean? And the answer would change the balance of power between the rich world and the rest of it forever. The answer came down on a Tuesday morning in March of 2024. The International Court of Arbitration ruled that electronic waste, once it crosses a border under false labels, does not become the property of the receiving country. It remains the legal and financial responsibility of the exporter. The companies named in the lawsuit, 3 of the world's top 5 electronics manufacturers, were ordered to fully fund the cleanup of Agbog-Bloshi, to pay restitution to the workers they had poisoned, and to repatriate every ton of hazardous waste they had shipped to Ghana over the previous decade. The price tag, $840 million. And for the first time, a court attached a name to the crime. It was not negligence. It was environmental apartheid. A deliberate system that calculated the value of a child's lungs against the cost of proper recycling and chose the cheaper option every single time. The ruling triggered a domino effect. Within 6 months, Ghana's government implemented real-time scanning at the port of Tema, catching containers of broken electronics before they could be trucked inland. The European Union closed the used goods loophole entirely, requiring all exported electronics to pass a functionality test before shipment. But the most devastating revelation was buried in the court transcripts. The audit that exposed the corporate cover-up also contained a spreadsheet. That spreadsheet showed that the cost of safely recycling 1 ton of e-waste in Europe was roughly $2,000. Shipping that same ton to Ghana and dumping it cost less than $200. The profit margin on suffering was over 90%. Now, here is what nobody expected. A year after the cleanup began, the heavy metals that had soaked into the ground for decades had not just contaminated the soil. They had seeped into the aquifer that supplies drinking water to 1.7 million people. The groundwater beneath Accra carried lead concentrations 10 times the safe limit. The official health report called it irreversible environmental damage. The people of Agbogbloshie had won their case, but the poison that was already inside their children's bones will not be erased by any court order. Yet amid the devastation, a single detail emerged that changes how you should think about every device in your pocket. The metal pulled from the burning piles at Agbogbloshie, the copper, the gold, the palladium, was worth an estimated $1.2 billion over the dump's lifetime. But the workers who extracted it were paid less than $3 a day. The wealth was real. It was just concentrated in boardrooms on another continent. And when the International Consortium opened the first formal recycling facility on the site, a clean plant with protective equipment and fair wages, it proved something the industry had always denied. You can recycle e-waste safely and profitably without burning a single cable. You just have to decide that the lives of the people doing the work are worth more than the convenience of a $200 shipping container. That decision is now yours. Because every phone you trade in still ends up somewhere. The question is whether you will look. The story of Agbogbloshie is not an isolated horror. It is the inevitable endpoint of a system that treats waste as someone else's problem. Every charger you toss, every screen you crack, every upgrade you choose for a slightly better camera creates a chain that ends in a fire on a continent far away. But that chain also works in reverse. Your decision not to look, your demand for cheap electronics, your willingness to accept the label recycled without asking where, these are the links that hold the whole machine together. The fire stops when someone decides it should. And the people of Agbogbloshie have shown that it can stop. The plant is open. The children are learning to read instead of burning copper. The water will take decades to recover, but the air no longer tastes like a factory. That happened because a community refused to be invisible. So the question isn't whether the problem can be solved. It's whether the rest of us will stand between the poison and the people who have been breathing it for our convenience. If this content made sense to you, there's something special I've set up through the link in the first pinned comment. It's for people who want to go deeper than just watching. Hit subscribe. Hit the bell. And if you believe that a phone should not cost a child her childhood, share this. Because the one thing this industry cannot survive is people who actually look.